Hello, everybody. I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes, and welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. And today we're going to be talking about a book that I actually only just finished recently on a recommendation by my father, who I normally don't listen to because I never listen to my father. In any event, uh, this is a history of the Mongol invasion of Europe, which is, intriguingly enough, uh, one of those areas of history that I think is more thought of and talked about and discussed in Eastern Europe, because Eastern Europe was the part of Europe that was actually victimized by the Mongol invasion. Um, and so there's certainly it does tend to be a bit of a gap, especially when discussing the Middle Ages for a lot of us. The other thing, of course, is that normally when people talk about Mongol invasions, they're normally basically talking about the Mongol invasions that happened in Asia, the Mongol takeover of China, um, and so we don't tend to associate that very much with Europe. Um, but this is a book that is not only, of course, an interesting read, or I wouldn't recommend it, it also posits in its very, very dramatic final line of this book that if Ogedei and Manchu had not died when they did, the largest empire that the world had ever known would have been bounded in the west not by the Carpathians and the Euphrates, but by the Atlantic Ocean. And this is a book that, like so many histories of wars, histories of empires, that it once again brings to bear that concept that empires stand and fall by the people in them, by the leaders in them. Because the thing about the Mongols, and it's very interesting when you're reading this book, he talks, he has a significant section of this book devoted to the Mongol tactics, how they won at warfare. He mentions that modern generals, several modern generals of the 20th century, were particular great believers and followers of of the uh, of the Mongol general Sube'etei, who is known as one of the great generals of history. And the thing about it is that these were people who, unlike many other, especially the Europeans, it's true I don't know nearly as much about Asian warfare, but certainly in Europe, tended to be war tended to be much more staid in Europe. It tended to involve a lot more. There tended to be a lot more rules. It resembled chess a lot more then than it does now in some key ways. In that, um, for example, in Europe, it really wasn't until the English came barreling through with their longbows that anyone really thought of having artillery barrages in Europe. Now, the Mongols came through before that, but the Mongols were, after all, unchristian savages and were safe to ignore because after internal disputes broke them up, everybody could happily pretend that they never happened. Um, but a lot of European warfare was siege warfare. It was, you set up your army outside of this castle, and you try to break the castle's walls, and the people in the castle throw stuff at you, hoping that you'll go away. You learn about sapping, where you dig under the walls and cause the castle to fall down. Mongol warfare, however, was warfare of the cavalry. It was warfare of the clash of individual soldiers. And unlike many, many other armies at the time, European armies in particular tended to be made up of a bunch of knights who didn't necessarily follow the orders of the person in charge, a bunch of people in charge of various bunches of knights who didn't necessarily agree with each other or coordinate, and a mishmashed rabble of conscripted random people, many of whom would tend to be armed with whatever stuff they got off of a farm. Um, you had a lot of poorly trained foot soldiers with things like, halberds and spears, and what they were supposed to basically do was just stand there at the front and hold the spear out and hope that they managed to, kill somebody before they got ran down by a knight on a destrier. Um, that it wasn't that there were no tactics in warfare or no skill, but the Mongols took it to a new level. They took it to the level of having an army that was entirely of trained soldiers. They took it to the level of having one person in charge that everyone actually followed the orders of. They took it to the level of having a chain of command. They took it, they had an organization in the army, in their army of, that the army is divided into multiples of 10. A 10,000 strong division is of 2 men. Each 2 men was divided into 10 regiments of 1,000 men, called Minghans. Each Minghan contained 10 squadrons of 100 men, called Jaguns, and each Jagun was divided into 10 troops of 10 men, called Arbans. And that is much, much closer to the military formulation we have today, where you have units of men, each with their own commander. Each of those commanders is under the command of a superior commander, and so on and so on. All of these things were extremely modern by comparison with how the armies in Europe worked. Now, I'm given to understand the Chinese army at that time, when they first met the Mongols, was more organized than in Europe. But the point is that Europe was very, very disorganized, and more than that, they were incredibly torn apart politically. And what this book really does is it shows how the politics affected the invasion, how things went or didn't, how things went well or didn't go well, precisely because of the of the constant battles and power struggles between the nobility and the church, and how and also how things fell apart for the Mongols, because Genghis Khan, or Chingis Khan, to be slightly more accurate, and he does try, the author of this book, James Chambers. Now, this was published in 1979, so some of this history may have since been made outmoded by new advances in research and translation. But one of the things that he says in his preface is that he tried to put in the pronunciations of the various names into something that was closer to that it was closer to their actual proper pronunciation, but he still tried to maintain the forms that these had all been known by historically, because otherwise, how are people to know? Now, the interesting thing about talking about something like the Mongols, about talking about anything from that long ago, is the kind of research that you have to do, especially with something like the Mongols, because the Mongols, they aren't like some cultures that left reams and reams of writings that you can use to figure out their culture, to figure out their history, to figure out what happened. Basically everything that we have on the Mongols, nearly everything, is secondary sources, or sources that were not the Mongols, but were people who are saying, here's what I saw when I saw the Mongols. You have drawings that were done by various Islamic artists, and this does go into the period in history when the Mongols roared through the Middle East, and in theory could have destroyed Islam, but again, because of internal factions, wound up not doing so. You have a Persian impression of Chingis Khan in battle on the lower level of that. And when people do these sorts of histories, they have to look at these and say, here's what this person looked like based on somebody's illustration. Here's information about how their battles must have gone based on what other people drew. Don't forget we have a country called Mongolia today, which is still settled by Mongolians, by Mongols, who have many of the same cultural practices and traditions that they did 700 odd years ago, which is when this book is about. It's about the 1200s into the 1300s for the most part. And you recreate the idea of this Mongol mounted archer that you see below. By the way, I apologize for my scans. Due to various complications, I had to use a different driver program, so my scans are all watermarked. So, you know, you're just going to have to deal with the horror of it. But you can see above the Mongol horsemen today, the saddle and harness have hardly changed, this reads. And you reconstruct things based on that. You reconstruct things based on letters that were sent by Christian missionaries and diaries of Christian missionaries who went to see the Mongols. You reconstruct it from the information and drawings and histories of Muslims, of the Mamelukes of Egypt, and just try to figure out how it all stitches together. And the thing about histories like this is that this is one of my personal favorite genres of nonfiction, which is the popular history. It's not an academic text. It's not a text that buries itself deeply in all of these primary sources to give you deep and complex intellectual discussions about it. It's a broad survey. It tells you the story. It introduces you to the major players. It gives you an idea of what this was all about. And these kinds of books are particular favorites of mine. And I recommend this because it's an interesting book about that moment in European history, and it's an interesting book about a moment that potentially changed history, a moment, one of those crossroads of history where there is a specific set of events that you can point at, that you can say, this is something that if things had gone slightly differently, the whole world would be different. Chambers lays out how the Mongol Empire could have become and been known as the greatest empire on earth. And I think those sorts of things are important things to know about history. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you next week.